Welcome to Night Vale is a long-running, surreal, and darkly humorous podcast that takes listeners to the fictional desert town of Night Vale. Presented as a community radio broadcast, it provides updates on the town's bizarre events, strange inhabitants, and mysterious occurrences. From glowing clouds that rain animal carcasses to a secretive dog park that no one is allowed to enter, the podcast blurs the line between the mundane and the extraordinary. Narrated by the smooth-voiced Cecil Palmer, voiced by Cecil Baldwin. Welcome to Night Vale mixes absurdist humor with creepy storytelling, weaving a world filled with conspiracies, oddities, and deeply human moments. It's a cult favorite for fans of surreal horror, offbeat comedy, and imaginative storytelling. Cecil Palmer adjusted the knobs of the microphone in the small, dimly lit radio studio. Outside, the eternal desert spread in every direction, an oppressive expanse of sand punctuated by jagged rocks and scattered cacti. In Night Vale, the town's strange pulse seemed to beat a little faster tonight, and Cecil could feel it in his chest. "Good evening, Night Vale," he began, his voice smooth and resonant, as if it were part of the desert winds. A friendly reminder to all citizens. The fog rolling into town this evening is, as always, sentient. Please do not make eye contact with the fog or speak to it directly. Doing so has historically ended poorly. He paused, glancing at the weathered script in front of him. A single note had been hastily scribbled in red ink. Mentioned the fog, but not its origins. Something in Cecil's gut tightened. He'd seen strange things in Night Vale, stranger than most could imagine. Floating cats, secret government helicopters, and faceless old women who lived in everyone's homes were part of daily life. But the fog was different. It wasn't just strange. It was aware. Outside the studio, the fog crept through the streets like a living thing, thick and gray, swallowing the faint glow of streetlights. It moved deliberately, coiling around buildings and slipping into cracks beneath doors. Somewhere near the abandoned bowling alley, a man named Evan Barnes stumbled out of his house, coughing violently. He was a new resident, fresh from a city far from the reaches of Night Vale's peculiar charm. He hadn't heard the announcements about the fog and hadn't seen the warnings posted at the post office, because no one used the post office anymore. Evan blinked against the oppressive mist, his vision blurred as he tried to make out shapes in the dark. His phone's flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the fog seemed to press against the light, swallowing it whole. "Hello?" Evan called, his voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The fog shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if in response. It wasn't until Evan heard the whispering that he realized he wasn't alone. Back in the studio, Cecil was mid-broadcast when the door creaked open. A cold draft swept through the room, sending shivers down his spine. He turned, expecting to see Carlos, his partner and the town's resident scientist. But the figure in the doorway was not Carlos. It was tall, unnervingly thin, and shrouded in the fog itself. Its face, or what passed for one, was obscured, but its presence filled the room with an electric hum that made Cecil's teeth ache. "Cecil," the figure said, its voice a chorus of whispers layered over one another. "The time has come to listen." Cecil swallowed hard, his hand tightening around the microphone. He didn't ask who or what it was. In Night Vale, it was often better not to know. "What am I supposed to hear?" Cecil asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one elongated arm and pointed toward the window. Outside, the fog was thicker than ever, swirling in impossible patterns. "It begins," the figure said, and then it was gone, leaving behind only a faint, acrid smell and an eerie silence. Evan's flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him on all sides. He turned in frantic circles, his breath coming in short gasps. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice breaking. A shape emerged from the fog, a shadow darker than the night. It loomed over him, featureless and immense, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. "You shouldn't have come outside," it said, though its mouth never moved. Evan tried to run, but the fog thickened, wrapping around his legs like chains. The shadow reached out, its form shifting and stretching, and for a brief moment, Evan felt the unbearable cold of its touch. Then he was gone, swallowed whole by the fog. In his lab, Carlos stared at his computer screen, his brow furrowed. The readings didn't make sense. The fog wasn't just a weather anomaly. It was emitting frequencies, signals that seemed almost like language. "What are you?" he murmured, typing furiously. The lights flickered overhead, and Carlos's equipment began to hum. A strange symbol appeared on his monitor, pulsating with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. It was like nothing he'd ever seen before. "Cecil needs to know about this," Carlos said, grabbing his phone. But before he could dial, the fog seeped under the door, swirling around his feet. "Carlos," it whispered, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Join us." Cecil's broadcast ended abruptly, replaced by static. The listeners of Night Vale were used to strange interruptions, but this one felt different. The static seemed to carry a faint voice, repeating the same phrase over and over. "It's already here." The phone in the studio rang, and Cecil answered, half expecting it to be Carlos. But the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "You've seen it, haven't you?" the caller said, their tone urgent. "The fog. It's not what you think it is." "What is it then?" Cecil asked, gripping the receiver tightly. "It's a doorway," the caller replied. "And something is coming through." Before Cecil could ask more, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, his mind racing. The figure, the fog, the shadow, all of it was connected. And if the caller was right, Night Vale was standing on the brink of something far worse than it had ever faced. As Cecil looked out the window, he saw the fog shifting again, forming shapes that resembled letters. They spelled out a single word. Cecil Palmer gripped the microphone tightly, staring at the fog's ominous message spelled out across the studio window. "Run." His mind reeled, but his instincts told him that running wasn't the answer. Night Vale had faced countless strange phenomena, from mysterious lights in the sky to creatures lurking in the dog park. But this fog felt different. It wasn't just a threat, it was an invitation. The phone on his desk buzzed again, startling him. He answered, hoping it was Carlos. "Cecil, it's me." Carlos's voice came through, calm but tinged with urgency. "Are you safe?" "I don't know," Cecil replied, glancing at the window again. "What's happening, Carlos?" "This fog, it's alive. It spoke to me, or maybe someone spoke through it." Carlos hesitated before answering. "I've been analyzing it in my lab. It's not just alive, it's communicating. The signals it emits are like a language, a complex code." And Cecil, Carlos's voice dropped to a whisper. "I think it's calling for something or someone." Cecil's stomach turned. Before he could respond, the static on the studio speakers shifted, forming a low, rhythmic hum that resonated through the room. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint voice. "It's opening," the voice intoned, distorted but unmistakable. "Prepare yourselves." Evan Barnes had disappeared into the fog, his screams swallowed by the thick, oppressive mist. But he wasn't dead, or at least not yet. He found himself in a place that defied logic, a shifting landscape of shadows and echoes. Shapes moved in the periphery of his vision, their forms flickering between the familiar and the grotesque. "Where am I?" Evan whispered, his voice trembling. The fog answered, its whispers forming a chorus around him. "You are here. You are nowhere. You are chosen." Evan stumbled backward, his foot sinking into what felt like solid ground, but looked like nothing at all. The shapes drew closer, their outlines sharpening into towering figures with eyes like burning coals. "You will bring it through," they said in unison, their voices reverberating in his skull. The doorway must open. Carlos worked feverishly in his lab, his equipment whirring and beeping as he tried to decode the fog signals. The strange symbol on his monitor pulsed steadily, each beat sending a jolt of unease through him. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a map, or maybe an instruction. What do you want? Carlos muttered under his breath, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The fog thickened outside his lab, pressing against the windows like an eager predator. The whispers began again, this time clearer. Carlos, they said, his name stretched into a distorted chant. You understand. You can help us. Carlos backed away from his computer, his heart pounding. Help you do what? Open the doorway, the voices replied. Bring it through. Bring us through. The door to his lab creaked open, and Carlos turned to see the fog spilling inside. He grabbed a small device, a prototype he had been working on to analyze electromagnetic fields, and held it up defensively. Stay back, he warned, though he wasn't sure if the fog could understand or care. The fog paused, swirling in place, as if considering his words. Then, without warning, it lunged toward him. Back at the Night Vale community radio studio, Cecil heard a loud knock at the door. He froze, the static hum in the background growing louder. The knock came again, harder this time, and the door rattled on its hinges. Who's there? Cecil called out, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The door creaked open, revealing a figure shrouded in shadow. It wasn't the fog, but it wasn't human either. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its presence filled the room with a suffocating pressure. Cecil Palmer, it said, its voice deep and resonant. The time has come for you to choose. Choose what? Cecil asked, gripping the edge of his desk. To stay, the figure replied, or to join us. The lights in the studio flickered, and the figure stepped closer. The fog is the threshold. It is the bridge. Through it, we will come. Who are you? Cecil demanded. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by the question. We are the beginning, and the end. Before Cecil could respond, the figure dissolved into the fog, leaving behind a single object on the floor, a small, glowing key. Evan struggled against the pull of the fog, his mind clouded by the voices echoing around him. The towering figures loomed closer, their eyes burning with intensity. You will bring it through, they repeated. Take the key. Open the door. A faint light appeared in the distance, cutting through the oppressive darkness. Evan turned toward it, instinctively moving forward. The fog is not just weather. It's a gateway, a bridge to something else. We have to stop it before it fully opens. I know, Cecil replied, glancing at the key in his hand. But I think they want me to open it. Don't, Carlos said firmly. Whatever's on the other side, it's not meant for our world. Before Cecil could respond, the static on the speakers rose to a deafening roar, drowning out Carlos's voice. The lights flickered violently, and the room seemed to tilt, as if reality itself was bending. The fog poured into the studio, swirling around Cecil and enveloping him in darkness. Cecil, the voices whispered, their tone almost soothing. It's time. At the edge of town, the massive door materialized, its presence undeniable. The symbols carved into its surface glowed with an eerie light, pulsating in rhythm with the fog. The towering figures stood guard, their eyes fixed on the door. Evan stood before it, the key now in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but the voices in the fog guided him forward. Open it, they urged. Fulfill your purpose. Cecil and Carlos arrived, just as Evan raised the key to the door. Stop! Carlos shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Evan hesitated, turning to face them. I don't understand, he said, his voice shaking. They said I have to open it. You don't have to do anything, Carlos said, stepping closer. Whatever they told you, it's a lie. That door leads to something we can't control. The figures growled, their eyes flaring with anger. He belongs to us. The doorway must open. Cecil stepped forward, holding his own glowing key. If you want the door open, he said, his voice steady, you'll have to deal with me first. The figures paused, their attention shifting to Cecil. You are the bridge, they said. You are the voice. Use the key. Cecil glanced at Carlos, uncertainty flashing in his eyes. Carlos shook his head, silently pleading with him not to do it. The ground trembled, and the door began to creak open on its own. The light